This is by far the easiest way to get this off. The bearing separator. And just catches that lip that's on this thing. I usually leave these just a tiny bit loose. So I make sure the center's up. This is just a standard kit that you get at Harbor Freight. And I heat this up with a torch first. Expands the metal a little bit, makes it easier to come off. Okay, now we want to get the snap ring off. This tool you can get at O'Reilly's. Works pretty good. I ground the end of it down a little bit to make those things a little narrower. Using the same setup, pull the gear off. I usually don't bother heating the gear, but if it is too tight, I tighten this down and it starts getting really tight and it's not breaking free, then I smack this with a hammer a couple times and that'll get started and it comes right off. Okay, now the snap ring around this bearing, this one's loose. If I can move it with my fingers, it's going to come right off, but if it doesn't move, that means the bearing's putting some upward pressure on it. So I take a heavy punch and I put it right on that part of the bearing, right in there, and go around it and smack it down with a hammer until this loosens up enough where it'll come right off. Okay, I grab the bearing and I rotate it. If I hear any noise, like a grinding sound, it's no good. If it's really loose, then I figure it's lost a lot of whatever grease or oil they put in here. So in order to get this plastic cover off, I have this tool right here. It doubles as an oyster shucker, but I can push down really hard right here and work it and get underneath it and then pry it up. And I can pop this thing off. I pop the one off the other side. And then if I want to clean the bearing, I put it in a little container with some gas and shake it up. Use a plastic container because you don't want to create a spark. And then I'll take a little brush and brush the bearings, get all the grease off, and I'll repack it with some bearing grease. And then you can press these black seals back on. Okay, now I'm going to pull this. It's a bearing cap is all it is. It's a pretty thin piece of metal. I can heat it up with a propane torch a little bit and it'll come off easier, but I usually save that for when I'm putting it back on. I can usually get it with the bearing separator pretty easy. Okay, I removed that bearing cap. You can see there's a little thin roller bearing. Actually, the whole gear will come off and exposes that split bearing. Notice there's a little O-ring on the top, or not an O-ring, but a washer on the top, plus a snap ring. Make sure you remember to put the washer on top of the bearing when you put it back together. Watch that washer now, it'll slide down when I remove the bearing. It's easy to forget about it when you put it back together. You get it on the bottom instead of the top, but you definitely want that washer on top, and don't forget to put this snap ring back on. Now we're going to get that snap ring off. My method of doing it is to put a lot of paper towel around it, and I take a needle nose plier, carefully place it on the end of each end of that snap ring, and then I smack this end, both ends at the same time. I use a big mallet, and it pops that spring down and off, and it goes flying, so that's why you put the paper towel there to catch it. Okay, the snap ring's off, and now you can see I've got the washer to remove and this flat bearing. I usually try to keep the bearing orientated, same side up, so I put it back in the same way. Now I got to get this thing off. This is called the hub, and I'll have to do a different setup. The whole reason of doing this is to replace the synchro because it doesn't have hardly any gap left for this fourth gear. I'll take that back. This is third gear. This is the fourth gear, and you can see there's sufficient gap on that synchro. Okay, I've got that bearing separator underneath third gear and a couple temporary wood blocks. There's a hole in my workbench top. This is just a homemade thing, and then I have a little porta power. Sometimes I use just the bottle jack. Anyway, that should pop that hub off of there. Okay, there you can see the hub and the gear are free. And when you inspect this, you can see there's still oil on this. I've taken some of these apart where this is totally dry. It was just metal on metal because they'd ran it low on oil for too long. And anyway, if these are heavily burnt looking and dry, then you know you got to decide what you're going to do. You're going to go ahead and take a chance on the parts or not. Okay, I did all this so I could replace the synchro. I don't know if you can see. This thing might not zoom in far enough, but between the brass and the steel, there's just a very small gap there. I mean, it would work for a while, but why not replace it with one a little better? Okay, I've got one. You can kind of see the gap there a lot better than the other one. That's what the hub looks like. You can see the synchro detents, they call them. You know, I always look at them, make sure they're in pretty good shape, kinda. I mean, you could put this back together without taking the slider off. You just have to be careful. But if you do put it back together with the slider off, there's some springs. There's 3 springs underneath those detents. I don't know if you can see them in that little gap or not, but I usually use a hose clamp that'll go around this and hold the detents in place, and then I slide this hub, the hub slider, over them. You can do that after you install this thing, or you can just try to install it with it like this. And what I usually do is just put it on here, and then I put a washer on here, aluminum washer, and then I smack it. Just tap, tap, tap all around. Now I could also take my propane torch and heat the inside of this up to expand it, and that'll make it a lot easier. The only thing you got to be careful about is, see those notches in the synchro? Got to make sure they line up with the detents when you get down to the final couple of smacks with your hammer. If they're not lined up, then you'll be pulling this back up again to try to get them lined up, and it could create a mess. Gotta make sure you install the hub correctly. Notice how the boss sticks up inside here. That goes down. And notice how the slider, this is where the shift fork rides, is up. And this is what the top would look like. So make sure you get that boss correct, the way this looks, this going down. Okay, this one went on pretty easy. I just used this big aluminum washer and I smacked it with a plastic mallet. Sometimes I'll use a piece of pipe, slide it down there and smack on the pipe. So make sure you clean out the pipe so you don't get any dirt bouncing around. Or you could press it in place too, doing this, but tapping it down after I heated up the inside of that hub with the torch a little bit too. Made it go on a lot easier. Okay, I put the thin bearing first, then the split bearing, and then make sure you put the washer on the top. Now is when you want to put the synchro back in. The brass thing right here, make sure you can't move it because the little notches line up with the detents. Now we got to put the snap ring on, and the way I do it is use channel locks. See, the channel locks are in place. All I have to do is squeeze and it'll pop that snap ring back in. Okay, I just slid 4th gear on. On top of that, you put that little bearing. See how 4th gear slides up and down there. put the bearing cap on. I usually heat it up a little bit, and then I'll set it on there, and I can usually tap it on with a rubber mallet. Okay, I heated it up so it was just hot to the touch, and it pretty much slid right on there. Now the bearing. Okay, I set the bearing as far as it'll go. I got that much gap to make up. I put my washer. I use aluminum because it protects everything. I'm just going to take this piece of pipe, set it here, and smack it down. Okay, the bearing is on. I'm going to make sure this groove is up on the top side. Now we can put the snap ring in. You'll know the snap ring or the bearing's far enough on if you can take the snap ring and kind of go around like this. It'll go right in the slot. If it doesn't, then you need to knock it down, the bearing down a little further. Something I do before I put a snap ring on is I take my channel locks and I squeeze to tighten up the snap ring a little bit, because when you remove it, it enlarges it. So I tighten it back down. Just squeeze it. You don't over squeeze it, but just tighten it down a little bit. Okay, there are two types of fifth gear. The small fifth gear, you see how it has that boss sticking up? Some of the earlier transmissions did not have a boss, and so they would work back and forth on there because the only thing holding them tight was the tips of the splines where they hit the back side. And so I made up these spacers. I had a machinist make them to replace that, or make up that boss. And what it does, it fits over the snap ring, holds the snap ring in there so it can never come off, and then it puts just enough gap between that bearing surface and the gear. And that's, like I say, that's only if you have a fifth gear that doesn't have a boss on it. That's just what I recommend. Now, if you took this apart and that fifth gear was wiggly, you definitely want to put the boss on there. I mean, definitely want to put this spacer in there. It's pretty easy to make. The thickness is 0.174 if I remember right. I'm going to heat up fifth gear just a little bit on my map gas torch. I'll just hold it in front here and just get it so it's kind of high. You don't want to overheat it because you might ruin the temper. You just want to get it very warm. And then I'll set that on there, and it'll either drop right in place or I'll smack it down there. So here again, I used my trusty aluminum washer and smacked it on. Now I just have to put the snap ring on. Okay, snap ring's on, and I forgot to mention, when you're putting snap rings on, you know, you use the channel locks to tighten them up a little bit, but when you put them on, don't expand them any more than you have to. Just barely enough to get it over that shaft and slide it down there and get it in place. Okay, now I'm going to put the last piece on, which is, this is the connector that connects you to the differential. And I'm going to heat it up, put it on there and smack it down, and then I'll be done. That's what it looks like. Make sure you put the correct side down when you put this connector on. Okay, that's first gear we're looking at. See those little notches on the teeth? That means it's a later model, like a 86, 87, 88. Those notches are the only warning you get unless you take the time to count the teeth. There's a different amount of teeth between the years, like 2 extra teeth, I believe, is the difference. And if you wanted to take this side off, it's pretty easy because you just pull the snap ring and then all this will come off at the bearing, and your hub right in here, you can get that off too, but you have to put the bearing separator underneath second gear here and put it in a thing, a press to press it off. It's a lot easier to do than the fourth gear side. Okay, I pulled first gear off. Watch out for that little bearing there. You got to make sure you get that back in. And you can see how that slides up and down. That's where the bearings, needle bearings are. Here, the only reason I'm taking this off is I thought maybe I'd inspect this synchro a little closer and make sure the detent springs are intact. You can see that spring right here. I'm just going to take a look at it, make sure they look good, and put it right back together. These are the different detents for the synchros. This is starting at the back end of the transmission. This is for the granny gear. This is for the first, second gear. It has a 51 on it. This is for the third and fourth gear. See, it's flat on the back and it has a spring under it instead of this type of a spring. And this is the fifth gear one. There's a 53 on the back. That's what it looks like on the top. Okay, I inspected the spring and it looks pretty good. Usually right here where that spring clip rests on this, it'll have a groove cut in it, and it can be pretty deep, almost all the way through the width of that spring, snap ring type looking thing there. This one looked pretty good, and the fact that it doesn't slide off when I push it up means that the spring on the back side is there. Because the only way you can get at the spring on the back side is to pull all this off. Alright, I found a synchro in my collection. It had a little more gap than that one, so I'm installing it. I just want to look at the teeth on the brass synchros. See how sharp the edges are on those? If they're all banged up and rounded over, it's not going to shift very well, and it might not stay in gear. It's the same with these little teeth. The synchro teeth that go around right here where the end of my thumb is, those little things. Make sure that they're not beat up and rounded over. They should be little sharp edges. If they're really beat up and rounded over, it'll usually pop out of gear. Alright, we're ready to put this back together. There's a tab down here on the bottom where you can clamp it in a vise and put it back together. It's called the intermediate plate, and there's a bearing here and a bearing here that you could replace. These are kind of hard to come by down here. This one you can get, but I usually don't replace it unless the car was making a noise, like when the engine's idling and the clutch is out. You're just sitting there. If there's a noise and then you push in the clutch, the noise goes away. That's this bearing right here. The only way to replace it is pretty much to tear the transmission apart. I mean, it's a lot easier. There's a way to get it in there without doing that, but it's more trouble than it's worth, I think. The only difference between the intermediate plates is this hole right here. There's a bigger hole here than on the later models than there is on the early models. Other than that, there's nothing different about it. And in this case, it looks like somebody replaced the seal at one time because it still feels soft in here, so I'm not going to replace it. And you can see where they tapped it in pretty far. Usually they're not in that far. Sorry about that. This is called the main idler, which goes in this spot right here. You want to check that bearing and make sure it's quiet when you turn it and doesn't wiggle around or move back and forth in this direction. And the gear on this and right here is different than it is on the early models. This is the later model. That big gear is the same on all years. It's just this one is different. And the gear that mates to this one is this one, which is on, you can see the big end of that thing. On the early models, it's the same diameter as this end. And this gear is also different between the years. I put these two shafts in. I just grabbed both of them and put them side by side so the gears meshed. and then kind of jiggle them and wiggle them until this bearing gets in about halfway. Okay, now with that bearing in there about halfway, I'll be able to set this in there. And at the same time, I'll have to set that shaft in there and get it into that hole right there and start working them in a little bit. And then once I get them started, I can start working these shafts back. All three or all four of them in at the same time. Okay, you can see where I got those, started working those in, and now this bearing is most of the way in, 3/4 of the way. Still got a ways to go on this one, but you just jiggle them and wiggle them and push and they go in. But if you do have a problem getting them in, what you can do is, before you put any of this together, is heat up this plate, especially if that seal isn't there. You can heat this plate up with a torch, get it nice and warm, and then that expands the metal and all this will go in a lot easier. See, that's got a ways to come yet. So is that one. So I'll just jiggle them and jiggle them until they're in there. Okay, they're in. I just have to stick out far enough temporarily to get the snap ring on that one and snap ring on that one. And then you can start putting everything back together. Okay, the snap ring is on that bearing, snap ring is on that bearing. And I just installed this plate. On these later models, it's also got this other little piece of sheet metal that goes here. But initially I put all 4 screws in loose, and then I kind of wiggle this thing back and forth until, and while it's simultaneously pushing up on this plate to get it so it's as tight in here as I can. You don't want this thing to roll back into the gear on the bottom. And then I tighten down when I'm pushing this up and holding the shaft where I want it. Then I finger tighten this one, and then once I get that one tight, I go around and tighten them all up with a ratchet. Now to inspect the shift forks, you look for excessive wear inside those grooves there. That rides on this. And if it's really sloppy, and this one's really hardly any movement at all. If it's really sloppy, you might want to consider having somebody weld the inside of those, and you can file them out or take a Dremel tool to them, or have a guy put it on a lathe and turn them, or just get some better used ones. One that goes on this fork, same thing. You look at those, you'll see the wear pattern. This one has just the tiniest little bit of wear right there. Not much at all. Some of them have really deep grooves in them. It just barely moves back and forth. Alright, we're going to put the shift shaft in. This is the top one. Notice how there's no hole. This is the middle one. See, there is a hole. And then the bottom one will have that thing attached to it. Okay, you see I've taken that top shaft and stuck it in the hole there. Now you got to get this on, which is for your reverse gear. There should be a spring in there, and I set that ball bearing in there. And I'm going to push that onto the end of the shaft, force the bearing down. It's spring loaded. I mean, you could take the Allen's plug out down here on the bottom and put it in after, but I'm going to go ahead and do it this way. And I'm holding this thing upside down from the way it goes. Okay, I managed to get it on. I put the fork into the slot, and I used this big punch. I had it inside here, and I used it to push down on the bearing just a little bit while I was forcing the shaft in. Now you want to take this shift fork, put it on there, and then shove the shaft through it. You can see this thing here, it's on the bottom. There's a little groove that the bearing would ride in, so when I push this over, it kind of locks it in there. And then I'm going to put the bolt in here and tighten it down to 14 foot-pounds. That's the bolt that goes in there. 14 foot-pounds. You see I put the bolt in, but I didn't put it in all the way. I kind of leave it temporary until I get the other shafts in. But don't forget to tighten them down. I did that once. It didn't work out too well. Now these things, the shift pins, they go inside there. You can see that hole up the top? After you get the top shaft in, you have to push that one in there. And to keep it in place, what I do is I put it in there, and I put this punch in there to hold it up into place. And while that's in there holding in place, I can push the shaft in from this side and get it past that pin, and that pin won't fall out. This is how I get the pin in there. I put that inside the hole and I slide it up, then I push that punch over to hold it up, and I can just leave the punch sitting there like that at an angle, and it holds it up in place, so I can push the second shaft in. Okay, I put the pin in there with the magnet. Now I'm holding it up, and I'll push that punch in from the other side to hold it in place. Okay, the pin is being held with that punch kind of wedging it in place. You could just put grease on the pins. Would probably hold them in there. Okay, now the first pin I put in is a long one. This is the short pin. I've greased it so it won't fall out of there. Now I can shove the shaft in, and while simultaneously holding on to that punch on the other side until I feel it go in past that first pin I put in. And if you keep this thing horizontal, that pin won't fall out, but grease will keep it there even if I do happen to tilt it. But just don't let that pin fall out, and you want to get it through there part way. That's what I'm going to do next. Okay, I have it in there, and I can move this in and out and it won't go anywhere because that pin has gone into the groove. I mean, no, it hasn't. It's resting against this. If it lines up with the groove that's in this shaft, I can see there's 3 grooves there, but there's also another one that will be down here. Anyway, keep that like that. Hold the shift fork in here and slide it right through the shift fork. You can see I slid it through this shift fork while I held that fork in place. Now I can slide it through that one. And then on this side, when I get that in there, I'm going to have to rotate this thing. Make sure that pin is still in there. Get it inside there like that. Now we're home free. Now it can still fall out because it can fall down through to the next one, so that's why I have the grease in there. Now we got to put the next pin, the long one, in the bottom here, and do the same thing for the bottom shaft with the punch and all that. Okay, I worked that pin in, and you can see the end of that punch holding it in place. Now I can take the bottom shaft. Well, I got a problem. I can only put the bottom shaft in going this way, so I got to pull this out, put it on the other side. Okay, that's better. Now I can put the other shaft in. The other shaft goes in so that those 3 notches are on the out, because they're going to eventually line up with those. See, I've got that in there, and I can just pretty much just shove it in there and knock that punch right out. You rotate that around and slip it over that. Now you know you have it done right is if you move this one forward. You can see that groove right there. So what that does is you've got metal there now in there holding that pin up. Now you won't be able to move the middle shaft. it won't go, I mean, it's not going to slide. It'll wiggle a little bit, but it's not going to slide right out because that pin is up and it's locking these two in place. If I move that in, so all three of these line up over here, now if I pull this out, or this one doesn't have the pin in it, I can move the shaft. See? Goes a lot further. I don't want to go so far that my pin falls out though. So that's how you check. You just pull that so that that slot is out, and then these should not go any further, and a little bit of wiggling back and forth. Okay, now it's time to put the bolt here and the bolt here and tighten them down. And once we've done that, we're pretty much done with this, so we can put the main cover on. We just got to make a gasket. I have to make a new gasket for it. Okay, I torqued them with this big old torque wrench to 14 pounds. When you put your torque wrench away, make sure you turn it back to 0 when you store it. Don't leave it on pressure. I guess that is will damage the thing eventually. So everything's back together. Tighten these down. And like I mentioned before, I think earlier on, is I've taken apart a couple of these transmissions where this screw right here has been almost all the way out or has fallen all the way out. And it's, I guess it's a common problem. There's been other people who have had that happen too. So pretty important to get the foot-pounds correct. Now I'm going to make a gasket, and I'll put this cover on. Alright, I got to insert this in the video because I forgot to mention this. This is a case that's been cut apart so you can see inside. This is the lower shaft. Before you slide this housing on, put a wire through the hole here and tie it off somewhere so the shaft can't slide forward, because when you're putting this on, it'll tend to grab this and push it forward. And when it does, it'll tilt that like that, and this thing will actually come out of the slot. And it's a little difficult to get it back in again if you've already put this back on and bolted it all up. You can see that once you do get it on, then you want to put this pin in here. Make sure it goes in to the slot. This is called a slider. It slides back and forth, which changes the gears. It slides on the hub. And yeah, it's pretty important. See how those, get some decent light here. See how those grooves look on this side versus this side. If you put this on backwards, it won't shift right. This is the 5th gear, and you notice this, it has a bevel. The bevel almost on this transmission almost always goes to the front. The only time it doesn't matter is if it has this type of looking grooves. Those little notches in them, I guess you'd call it. That always goes towards the synchro. And if you happen to put it on backwards, it just won't shift right. So if it has those on both sides, then you can reverse it as long as the slot in the middle is in the center. I like to assemble the hub before I install it. So you see that one detent there on the bottom floating free, and you can see I've dropped the other 2 in their slots. That bump that you see on the bottom of that detent, when I put it in, that should go down. Okay, now the 3 detents are in there, and I want to drop the spring in. There'll be one on this side, one on the back side. And when you install them, you got to make sure that you don't install them identical like that. You've got to have it overlap each other. kind of like that. And you can see right there at the tip of my thumb where the end of that snap ring is, and the other one's right down here. When I flip it over, that one has to come around that back side there to cover that gap. Okay, now when you put this on, make sure when you tap it on, I tap it on, it'll take some, I take a big socket that'll fit over this, and I tap it on. But make sure you have the shift fork on it. I'm going to go ahead and put that on. Okay, now I have the shift fork on. The pin is just sticking out, so this is loose. And I'll take a big socket and put on here. I'll tap it in. Make sure that the detent slot right here, that detent lines up with the notch in the synchro. So when you're tapping it on, you're going to tap here, and then you're going to tap this a little bit to make sure that it's not binding. And then you're going to make sure that your vibrations aren't knocking the synchro off like that. So just be aware you got to keep that synchro on there, and the notch has to be lined up with the detent. You can see I've got this tapped on pretty close. I'm using the socket that's big enough to cover, have clearance around that shaft, and I'm tapping it on. Okay, I've got it on there, and now we gotta put the snap ring. I like to take like I showed you before, take my channel locks, tighten this thing up so it goes on there real tight. Otherwise, the shield, when it goes on, won't go over it. There's not much clearance there. So when you tighten it up by squeezing it with the channel locks down a little bit, and then when you put it on, don't overexpand it. Otherwise you won't be able to get this on. So I use the channel locks to kind of squish it down, tighten it up a little bit. You see the little notches? They're kind of equally spaced. That's where the splines, when this kind of moves back and forth, it kind of makes little indentations. So after I do a transmission and take it all apart, instead of putting it back the same way, I turn this around so that those little notches are facing the engine, and then I get a clean side out here, so it's going to go on this way, and then when it pounds against the notches, it'll make new notches. But just a better for wear and tear, less movement, better to switch. Okay, I got the shield on. You can see the snap ring in there, and now you just have to put this retainer on to keep the shield locked in place, and then don't forget to hammer that pin down. Okay, I just hammered that pin down, but you don't have to hammer it. You can use channel locks and you can squeeze it into place. Okay, after I get the transmission together, I always put a shifter on it. I pull the lever, push the bottom of it forward, put it in four-wheel drive. And then I can feel this, put my finger on this, put it in gear, turn the shaft, and make sure all the gears work. Go through all the gears, including extra low. Okay, when you put the last plug in, make sure it's the one with the magnet. It catches any metallic debris that breaks free in the transmission and holds it right there. And then one of the last things to go on would be the Speedo unit. It's got an O-ring on it. I've never replaced the O-ring, but I always put some non-hardening gasket compound around it before I put it in, and make sure it's all clean. You're not going to push any dirt in. This is the later model, which there's a number, if you can see it there on the bottom center, 22. That's for the later model. Earlier model ones I believe is 20 or 19, I don't recall. But if you have the mixed differentials, like, it might not make any difference. If you know, this has the later differential with the 4.1, but it's possible to put this transmission in a car that has a 3.73 differential. In that case, I'm not sure what teeth you should use, but the 22 is for the 4.1 differential. Okay, you notice that when I put this together, I have these bolts, which are I don't know what size they are, but they're oversized compared to the ones that are supposed to go in here. And that's because this side is threaded so that you can put this oversized bolt in there. And what I'd use them for is to hold this together, because I've used gasket compound. I don't want it to separate. There's one on each side, and then the one on top here is just temporary. When you go to install this thing, you take this one off, leave these in, go ahead and install the transmission, get all the bolts in, and then take these two bolts out last and put in the correct bolts. That way this seal isn't broken. Here you can see the difference in size. I believe this is an 8 by 1.25 and this is a 10 by 1.25. And that's the one that's 2 inches long that I use in here. And then after you get that tranny installed, well, just forget about the nut. You would install this to bolt it to the differential. Okay, this is the differential that the transmission bolts up to. Note these steel pins, alignment pins. There's one here and there's one up here. Make sure those two pins are there, and make sure this O-ring is here. I usually don't replace the O-ring, even if it is kind of old. They're flat. They stick up enough that they work, and I just glue it in place with some non-hardening gasket compound and then smear it up when I put the transmission in. Now you want to watch out, because those alignment pins, if there's one in here and you go to try to install a transmission, it's going to bump up against the one on the differential. And I have seen these transmissions come in where the pin stayed in this one instead of the differential, and it's really easy to not notice that. So there should be no pins on this intermediate plate, they call it. One down here, one down there. The pins would be in the differential housing only. Okay, now we're going to talk about the unit that goes in there, which is this thing right here. So rusty it is. This is a piston with spring loaded, and it goes up and down, but it'll be froze up. You can see these were all froze up. You can see that one's stuck in the down position, that one's stuck down, that one's probably been freed up, that one's still stuck. But the way I fix them is I drill a hole, 3/16 hole in them, and then I can put a drift punch in there, 3/16, and I can knock that piston free. And then just start lubricating it. And once I get it free, I grease up the piston real good. And then I tap this for a 1/4 bolt, or you could use a metric if you wanted. And plug that hole, and then I can install that thing back in here. Not really sure what it's for, except for maybe to help you keep from putting it in reverse by accident. Kind of forces you to push against a spring-loaded thing to get it into reverse. Alright, let's talk about the shifter. This is the plate that goes on top of the transmission right here. See that? Those pins that stick out on each side, they should be round. When they're beat up and decrepit, like they're flattened on the left and right sides, it might shift all right, but you might consider trying to find one that has round pins. And when your thing gets all rusty in there, and you don't ever fix it and drive around with it all rusty, this is what goes into those pins. You can see the slot right there that they ride in, how elongated it or beat up it is, I should say. The only way to fix this would be to weld it and recut the groove. The end of it has a plastic cup, and if it's too rusty and that has lost metal, then the cup doesn't fit on there very snug. And then the next thing you got to be concerned about is the rubber boot that's supposed to be right here where this rubber ring is. That's what the rubber boot looks like, stock, and they get tore up. You can see it's got a hole in the center there where it broke free from that ring. And here's a replacement boot that comes off of a Jeep. I don't remember. You'd have to look at the Tercel site and get the information on it. They've got it in there under parts. But one of the Jeeps. Then this is the plastic cup that goes on the end, and I usually like to lubricate this stuff up really good with grease when I put it back into the car. And the importance of that boot is to keep water from running in and collecting in here. This can fill up with water and then it just rusts the heck out of everything and rust up this shaft, and if the shaft gets rusty enough, it'll bind up when you're trying to shift. I only had one transmission do that.